In this video, I'll show you how we install this slatted wood acoustic wall using panels like this.
So we'll show you all the tricks we learned to measure, cut, glue, staple, and install these panels on the wall, including around outlets. Here's a box of 6 acoustic slat wall panels, and this is what one looks like. And you can actually buy a sample pack and see which one you want to use in your room. Here are the main tools that we used on this project.
You can see my fingers are getting banged up, just getting cut on these edges. And if you want to avoid a lot of nicks and cuts, some thin gloves like this might be really handy.
And if you're going to be cutting inside, I really recommend getting a box fan, putting a house filter on the back with the arrow pointing in the correct direction, as this really helps filter out the dust in the room.
So unfortunately, this window ledge sticks out, and obviously that gets in the way of running this up to the window edge. So we're gonna have to cut this out. And we're gonna use this router with this flush cut bit to take that off. And it's gonna make an awful mess.
So obviously you may not have the same issue to deal with, but if you do, a router works really well, even though I think I was pushing it in the wrong direction here along this bottom sill. And I'd recommend following it with a vacuum, because otherwise this throws sawdust everywhere. And the router can't reach all the way to the end, so I had to use a pole saw to finish off that little cut. That was nice and easy. So this is pretty flush, but not perfect, but that's okay. And after a quick vacuum, we'll paint it.
And Steve was quite clever here and painted around the outlets all black, so that in case there's any misalignment or gaps between this wall and outlets, you won't even be able to tell. So I think that's a really good tip.
Steve used this dark paint for the ceiling and the trim around the room. So here we're painting any bare wood and anywhere where the acoustic panels end, so that any gaps will be less noticeable. And we also painted here along the wall at the corner of the window in case the acoustic panels don't meet up as perfectly as we'd like.
So we were debating whether or not to leave this molding down here, but in the end Steve decided to paint it dark and keep it. Which means we're gonna have to cut every single panel because they're all exactly the right height for this room. Whether you keep the molding or not, there are gonna be these little grooves here, whether it's on the carpet or on top of the molding, that end up getting dusty over time and will be pretty hard to clean, but you probably won't notice it that much. So the directions say that the appearance of the side cuts here, that's kind of MDF, can vary depending on the orientation of this panel. So let's try and see what it looks like. Here's it going in one direction. Let's flip it over. And here is going in the other.
And I think you can see the one on the left is darker than the one on the right. So once you pick a direction and the felt tab is going to the right or the left, you need to stick with that because the felt of one panel meets up with the slat of the next. Before we made any final cuts on our panels, we wanted to do a little bit of testing.
So I have a really high tooth count saw, ultra finish, that will hopefully give a really nice cut on this slat. We're just gonna cut an arbitrary amount off just to test. Here goes.
And as you can see, I'm using a speed square to guide the saw in a nice straight cut.
So these first ones look pretty good. And then there we can see a little bit of chipping and on that one as well. But I'm not sure that's gonna be noticeable when it's all the way down on the floor. Okay, now we're gonna try flipping it over. Because they say sometimes the saws cut better when they're going up and it won't chip off the material, so that the saw blades will be going like that. That sounded like chunks broke off. I think this might be the way to go because all these cuts look perfect. There's no chipping at all, even though it felt like it took a chunk off at the end.
We wanted to try a jigsaw anyway, even though starting it with the speed square was pretty much impossible.
Maybe I'll start it and then move it up to it.
Which is already a bad mark against it.
There we go, now it's on there.
And we're using this laminate blade for the test cuts, and just for comparison, here's a regular wood blade.
Hit a staple?
I don't know, it feels like I'm stuck on something.
You might have hit a staple.
Yep, exactly on a staple. Okay.
So we moved over a little bit and tried again. And with this cut, we are actually removing all the staples supporting the ends of the slats, and you'll see what effect that has.
So here's the jigsaw cut, and it's actually quite a bit rougher than the circular saw. You can see a lot of chipping there and there. And one thing I noticed as I was trying to hold the speed square on there is that these really moved around a lot because we just happened to cut the staple off on the other side of this cut. So that meant that these are very free to move around, which would really affect your ability to make a straight cut. And even as I was pushing the jigsaw through, it kind of pushed the one that it was going through up a bit. So on my first attempt at the cut with the jigsaw, it hit the staple exactly on the edge and I couldn't go any further.
So we're not going to use a jigsaw.
So we want to test cutting these with the oscillating tool, and we have this piece of wood clamped here so that we can make sure to get a nice perpendicular cut. So here goes nothing.
So the oscillating tool ended up working really well, and we'll need to use this when we have to cut slats away to make room for outlets.
That looks like it worked.
Yeah.
And it also cut through the felt easily as well, so sometimes you needed to support the piece a little.
It gets a little bit of the black from the tool on there, but maybe that'll go away as we use it.
But here's one lesson from our first real cut for an outlet.
So we had clamped the board on here like this, and we didn't really think through that meant that we're cutting on the side that we want to keep, which means we could err on that side. And as you can see, this cut went a little wide, but had we clamped the board on the other side, that cut, no matter which one it is, looked really good. So lesson learned.
Make sure to clamp over the parts of the slats that you want to keep and cut towards the parts of the slats that you're going to remove. And that should help get nice clean cuts like these.
So we're going to use a staple gun and some T50 half-inch staples to secure those on the felt.
So after we saw how much those slats wiggled on the felt, we thought we should add extra staples before any cut. So here we're using a combination square to make sure that the staple gun is lined up with the slats and doesn't send a staple through the side. If any staples stick out a bit, you can just pound them down with a hammer.
They still wiggle, but not as much.
In the end, we found that this was a bit of overkill, so we just make the cut and put the staples in after.
Here's a good illustration of why you want to add staples when you cut the boards a little shorter, because that wiggles quite a bit. And over here, where we put staples, it's quite solid. Another good reason to staple. Sometimes we forget to do this before we do the cut, but especially on this end that's so short, because there probably only staples here.
We would also add staples around any holes that we cut for outlets.
Problem solved. And these staples are different on this one. So making precise measurements with the tape measure can be really hard in the corner. So to avoid that, we're going to do a little trick. So just measure some offset, and in this case we're doing 4 inches. So now we see that's 87 and 9/16 plus 4, so that's 91 and 9/16.
And this is best done with 2 people, so the other can hold the tape measure straight up and down using a level.
If we're going to start here and do the wall both directions, and our thinking is we start clean so that when we get to the other side of the window, we can manage this if we had to cut a little bit off or something for the window itself. So this is going to be our first slat running along the side of the window, and it looks like we avoid the outlet and the speaker post systems. So our first slat should be pretty easy. So we've drawn our cut line right there, and we'll make sure the saw blade lines up with that line before we start cutting.
And as with any cuts where you want a precise fit, it's better to cut a little wide, do a test fit, and shave a little bit more off if you need to.
Yep, that's a little tight.
Yeah, that's like almost an 1/8.
And luckily, that's really easy to do with the circular saw.
Does it fit? Yep. Okay, so we actually have a little bit of wiggle room in this piece, but we think if anything, it should be tighter to the ceiling, because you'll see that. But way down here, you're not gonna notice if it's not hanging over the molding exactly right. And this is gonna be behind the TV anyway.
So it's time to glue in our first panel.
We decided to use liquid nails because it was the cheapest. So we cut a bit off the tip there, and there's a foil inside that we had to pierce. And then really, it's nice to wipe that down before folding it against the caulking gun again. There we go. And now it's stuck in there. Whoa, it's already coming out. All right, Steve, you wanna do the honors? So the instructions say to make a nice Z pattern with the adhesive on the back. One of the tubes said it could do 30 linear feet, but of course that depends on how much you're squeezing out.
We ended up using 8 tubes to put up 27 panels, so about 3 1/3 panels per tube. Another reason we chose this liquid nails is because it had a longer working time. Many of the glues said they had instant grab, which scared us a little.
All right, boom. All right.
I'd go from the top if I were you, don't you think?
So we're being very careful with this first panel to align it with the side of the window and make sure it's perfectly straight up and down, because that will impact all the rest of the panels that you put up.
Each pack of 6 slats came with about 66 screws, so we're gonna put 10 screws in each slat. And I think the main function of these screws is to hold the slat on the wall while the adhesive dries. You might be going to wood there, huh? Because obviously you're not gonna be hitting a stud with every single one of these screws.
So we worked our way down the panel, putting 2 screws about every 21 inches.
And this we're just using as a handy spacer for the screws. And you can see the screws when they catch reflections, but really from far away, it just all blends in. So our first board. And look, there's a gap here where it's just the paint and you can hardly tell.
And here are some tips about screwing these in from further on in the project.
Okay, so as we screw these onto the wall, remember we're just going into drywall. So when you screw, you don't want to go too far because you'll dimple in. But at some point you're also just going to be chewing into drywall and you'll just bore it out. Happen to hit a stud or something, that's where you really need to be careful that you don't go too far in because you'll dimple the whole thing.
So just something to keep in mind, it's really hard to tell where one panel begins and the other ends. So it's the first and 2, 3, 4th gap that you want to put screws in, or at least that we're putting screws in.
To figure out where to cut the panel to fit around these speaker terminals, I'm holding a combination square just above the top edge of the wall plate while Steve puts a piece of masking tape. And we do the same thing again for the bottom edge.
1 1/4 gives us a teeny bit of clearance, and we're cutting right in there. All right, so we need to cut out this green square right here, because this width right here goes between these 2 pieces of felt, which is very conveniently.
So this is the cut that we messed up by putting the board and clamps in the wrong position, but once we did it right, the cuts came out really well. After a quick vacuum, we put some tape down to guide our cuts, made lots of downward passes with the oscillating tool, and removed that square of felt.
There's our first hole, and watch it not fit the outlet at all. It's gonna be like an inch too high. Precision fit. That looks great.
Yeah.
And so even though we cut the felt a little wide on that one, you can hardly tell. Steve, can you point to where we have a gap? And it's very hard to tell because of the wall being painted black. Look at that beautiful S pattern. You probably want to be careful around the outlet, not get it too close, lest it squeeze out.
And you can see here we did put some extra staples on those slats because those are likely to be bumped into if anyone's messing with those speaker posts. Then we stuck it up on the wall, being very careful not to smear that glue over the speaker posts or the other panel, and made sure that it was firm up against that first panel. Finally, it was the usual screws.
So that wiggles a bit, so we're gonna put a screw there.
Plus a few extras around the hole.
So this is our first board that actually intersects the outlet like this, and the outlet edge goes right halfway down this board. It seems like most people just cut the whole board out right there, so it'll be a slightly bigger gap to the left, so we'll probably just do that. So we've cut this part away, but since the outlet wasn't that full width, we're only gonna cut part of this felt backing away. And so I've marked the line with the tape, and we'll use the oscillating tool to do it. So on this one, you can see it took up 3 slats for that outlet, but over here, we only had to cut 2, and we only have to cut 2 here as well. So 3 is the most you'll ever have to do for a single gang outlet. And we just happened to get really lucky with this 2 gang box because it fit almost perfectly in these 3 slats.
So we kept putting up more panels as we moved leftward on the wall and had to cut out holes for another outlet until we got to the panel that would reach the corner.
All right, this gap is 7 3/8 wide, which over here means we have to cut the felt off of this side, so all of this felt. So I put a wider blade on because I'm gonna try and go through it at an angle like this rather than trying to cut a million times like that. And this edge is gonna be against the wall. We're never gonna see it. So even if I scruff it up a little bit, as long as I don't nick that part.
This technique worked relatively well, but I'll show you later how we used a circular saw, which I don't think I would have done in this case, being so close to the edge of the slat.
And in this corner, we have this funny little thing we need to work around. That looks like it works.
So in our case, this was pretty simple because we just had to cut a little bit of felt off, but you may have to remove one or more slats for your last piece. So from here, you can see these last two panels are slightly lighter color, but as you move to this side, they blend in a lot better. And these were actually from a 4-pack and not a 6-pack, and these are the ones that had the different kind of staples on the back. So maybe these came from a different factory, and that's what accounts for the slight difference.
From this view, it looks like we're done. Oh no.
All right, so as we measure across the top section here, over here on the left side of the window, we're at about 10 3/4. In the middle, we're more like 10 1/2. And over here on the right, we're about 10 11/16. So we're just gonna run 10 11/16 across the entire window. It'll be sticking down a little bit in the middle, but you'll never see it. So we can actually get a factory cut on both this side and this side from one board. We can use this as the top, measure down to 62, and then for the top part, we can measure up from the bottom, our 10 11/16. So we'll have a factory cut facing down and a factory cut facing up. Once we figured out that the top isn't completely even, we figured we better measure this bottom as well. So we had 62 1/8 across most of the window. Here we're about a 16th shy of that. So we will stick up just a tiny bit down here. But again, we want a smooth edge on the slats. Otherwise you'd see a step down. So we'd rather have it stick up just a tiny bit on the end.
So we cut our first board to 62, and you definitely want to support that end with another sawhorse or a friend to make sure that your cut comes out well.
It's so cool how as soon as you put it against the other one, it's just like you can't even tell that it's a separate piece. Boom. It's a little proud of the lip up here just by like what, a 32nd of an inch? Maybe, yeah. But it looks super clean.
So we kept cutting pieces to height and placing them on the wall, using the level with each one and trimming it if necessary to make sure that we're getting a straight line across the top. And we stopped once we hit the edge of the window. Then, from the remnants of each panel, we cut the upper pieces and glued and screwed them into place. And we were aiming to have a factory edge around the perimeter of the window, but in the end, the cuts with the circular saw were so good that I don't think it really would have mattered. Before gluing in this last top piece, we decided to put the next panel up to make sure that it was all lining up correctly, and that this next panel would be straight up and down. Luckily it was, so we glued them in.
Got it?
Yep.
So we kept installing more panels as we worked our way down the wall, and then
we just noticed some damage on the edge of this one, which we already put up. So we're gonna unscrew it and take it off the wall. And this is an advantage of using non-instant stick glue. That wasn't so bad, was it? All right, so replacing that wasn't too bad.
And after a couple more panels that spanned an outlet, we are down to the very last piece in the corner.
So we think we might just be able to fit one slat alone with felt on either side for this very last piece.
And we'll need the felt to be a bit wider up top.
For this last piece, we want this slat with felt there coming all the way under here. So we're gonna remove this slat. So we're gonna have to flip this over and remove all these little staples. So what you wanna do is open up the pliers, push the felt down away from it, grab the top of the staple, and then pull out.
And once you remove them all,
there we go. So be careful of this one because it still has staples sticking out. Now we just need to cut down the felt.
so we tried scissors quickly instead of the oscillating tool, but that didn't work very well. So instead, we drew a line with permanent marker down the felt and used a circular saw. And this worked really well actually, even when the piece didn't fit quite right, and we had to trim a bit more off. But in that case, we had to use the scissors to clean up the cut. Then some glue.
Okay, it's the last piece.
And no screws for this last piece in the wall. And how beautiful and satisfying is that? In total, this took us about 12 hours over 2 days.
So if you like videos like this, you might like this one here. Steve, you were born for this. You did that in one take.
I'm telling you.
Look at you.
I should get another 2%.
Holy smokes.
Saved you time.